Okay. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to Valley Beth Shalom's Tuesday evening text class from Rabbi Farkas. I'll be teaching Pirke Avot this evening. I'm joined by a number of my students, which is really great to have all of you here in one way or another. And want to welcome everyone who's out there on the internet. Hoping you're enjoying your time and are staying home and staying healthy and staying safe. Happy Cinco de Mayo, Jeffrey. It's nice that you wore the sombrero. I appreciate it. It's a nice kippah you have going on there. Really appreciate that. Friends, let's begin with a blessing over learning together. For those of you who want to recite it, please recite it with me. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitzanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Praise to you, Adonai, our God, who enriches our lives with holiness through the mitzvot of learning Torah together, and together we say, Amen.
Are we muted?
Okay, so what I want to do is we're going to begin a several-week class on Pirke Avot. We're going to learn one or two Mishnayot at a time, and we'll go as long as we can. We'll go right into the summer. And if you have friends or family who you think this is a great class that you want them to be a part of, go ahead and text them and let them know, and they can become part of the Zoom class with us, or you can share the feed out on Facebook or the YouTube link and let people watch that way too. So it's really nice. We have a little audience being built. It's nice to see Linda Stern is on with us, and Susan Feldman and Natalia are all on Facebook with us. We're going to go ahead and begin our learning. And let me just give a minute introduction to Pirke Avot. I think it's important that we all get a little bit of an introduction to what Pirke Avot is and what it means for each and every one of us. So Pirke Avot is really interesting. It's a really interesting text. It's called Ethics of the Fathers. And when we talk about what is Ethics of the Fathers, what we talk about is there are maxims or axioms from which and how we live our lives. And whether we like it or not, or understand it or not, every one of us has these axioms in our lives. It really is the way that we look at the world. It might be some kind of piece of advice that your family or your father or your mother gave you. It could be something as simple as, how do you know when the cake is done? And how do you know when the brisket is done? Or this is how you treat a friend. This is how you treat a family member. This is how you treat a fellow member of your community. Or where your father or your mother or your friend takes you to the side and says, you know, what you did right there, that wasn't really great. So each of us has these moments where these big ideas actually permeate and sort of guide the values of our life in one way or another. And Judaism's no different. We don't just take our values from the Torah itself. We take it from the rabbinic literature, which we call Mishnah and Torah and Talmud. And the book that tries to put these axioms in one place is called Pirke Avot, or Ethics of the Fathers. And then just one more word about that book. So the first thing you should know is that the word Pirke Avot itself is a double entendre. It doesn't just mean Ethics of the Fathers. The word parak in Hebrew means chapter, but it could also mean a portion of or a section of. And the word avot is very much a double entendre. The word avot in Hebrew has two meanings. It both means ancestor or forefather, literally, because the word av comes from the word that means father, right? The word abba, you might know. But it also means, avot could also mean first or first idea or first principle. The way that we understand this in Jewish rabbinic literature is that when there are certain number of obligations that we must refrain from doing on Shabbat, and those are called the 39 milachot, or more technically the 39 av milachot, the 39 categories of prohibited work on Shabbat. And the word av melacha means principled action, principled category of action. So Pirke Avot would be the chapters or sections of principled actions that we should take for all of our lives, not just for doing specific mitzvot. And what Pirke Avot is a guidebook originally written by rabbis for rabbis. It was written by leaders for leaders. It was the original leadership training manual about how when you arrive to a community, what kind of community can you be the rabbi for? What are the things that you should be thinking about? How should you approach your work? Those are all questions that are brought up in Pirkei Avot, is quoted by the various rabbis found inside of it. And we know that what's good for the rabbi is probably good for the rest of us too. So it's come to mean so much more than just the original rabbinic field manual. The last thing I want to say about Pirkei Avot in general before we get to our study tonight is that it's the only book in the Mishnah that doesn't have a Gemara attached to it. There are plenty of commentaries written on it, but the Talmud never decided to question or interrogate the Mishnayot found in Pirkei Avot. Every other book of the Mishnah, I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure I'm right about this. Every other book of the Mishnah, every other chapter has a Talmudic Masechet or Talmudic tractate associated with it. Pirkei Avot does not. Now, there are plenty of commentaries, as I said, and we'll get into a couple of those. But the idea is that I think that the Talmud didn't want to open this book and then ask each of the rabbis to justify why they felt what they felt. It's sort of like asking the Constitution of the United States why the Constitution exists. There are reasons why decisions are made inside the Constitution, and we have a whole long piece of legal literature in American history. But the question as to why our country needed a constitution is never asked by the courts. That's not the court's job. And I think the Talmud teaches Pirkei Avot, or approaches Pirkei Avot the same way. So, and with that being said, I want to invite those who are on Zoom with me to go ahead and ask me a couple of questions before we get into the texts. You have any questions about the structure or about Pirkei Avot in general before I go in and start teaching tonight's Mishnah? Nope. Okay, then we're good. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we'll start tonight's class. Oops, I think that's the wrong screen. 1 second. There it is. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. So what I want to do is we're going to go ahead and take a look. Before you study Pirkei Avot, there's an extra Mishnah from a different book called Sanhedrin, which is always read at the beginning of the study of Pirkei Avot. Every time you start a new chapter, you read this Mishnah from Sanhedrin first. So go ahead and I'll go ahead and read it for you. It says, Kol Yisrael yesh lahem chelek leolam haba, shene'emar, ve'amecha kulam tzadikim leolam, yerushu eretz nitzar mitate ma'aseh yadei lehitpa'er. All Jews, every one of Israel, share in the world to come, for it says in Isaiah, a people are all religious, or they are righteous, I should say, righteous. They shall inherit the land forever, the branch of my planting, the work of my hands, that I may be glorified. So I love that this is what, every time you start with a chapter of Pirkei Avot, it's not in any other Talmud study, just here in this book, you begin every time with this Mishnah. Kol Yisrael yesh lahem chelek leolam haba. So the rabbis in some of the commentaries ask, why do we start with this? You could just go right into the first Mishnah. It doesn't make sense. Why no other Mishnah needs a preamble? Why do you need a preamble here? And the answer they come up with is quite moving. It says essentially, each and every person belongs or has a portion in the world to come. Each and every Jew in this case. And you have to ask the question is, why is it that this is the preamble? What is the question that this preamble is coming to answer? And in the commentaries, they refer to this as thinking about exile. If this is the first of the first, That is, it's the first Mishnah. It's the first thing that someone should learn. It's the first principle, again, playing on those words, Pirke Avot. Then the first question you should answer is, why do I suffer so much? I've always been taught that if we live in exile and we're waiting to return to the land of Israel, the land promised to us over and over again, waiting to return to a life that feels redeemed and loved. And if that's the case, then how do I feel connected to my tradition? And so it's almost as if the end is given in the beginning. It says, don't worry. Each and every one of us has a portion in the world to come. Each and every one of us has a capacity for righteousness. Each and every one of us has a capacity to inherit something beautiful. And that by engaging in this Torah study, you're participating in the very act of redemption that you seek so much. And so the Mishnah begins, this Pirke Avot begins with a promise and a blessing. It's like it begins with the end in mind, so to speak. Each and every one of us has a place in the future. No matter how sad you are, no matter how downtrodden you are, no matter how isolated you feel, no matter how beaten up and tread upon you are, each and every one of us has a place in redemption. And that's such a wonderful promise. And so we begin our study tonight with that idea, with that promise that even in these times when we're really, really isolated from each other, and it feels like a solution to this crisis, this invasion on our bodies is so far, very far away, that that to remember at the very beginning, the very end, and that each one of us has a place and a stake in the world to come. It doesn't mean that we're not free from our obligation to pursue that. In fact, that's what the entire rest of the Mishnah is about, is how do you pursue those ends? But the fact that the ends exist is a blessing that we begin with. And so let's take a look at the first Mishnah. It says, Moshe kibel Torah misinai, mosra leYehoshua, leYehoshua lezekenim, lezekenim leneviim, uneneviim masara la'anshe knesset hagadola. Hem amru shlosha devarim havu minutim badin. Ba'amidu talmidim harbe, ba'asu siyag laTorah. So the very first of the first after the blessing says, Moses received the Torah at Sinai and gave it to Joshua, and Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets transmitted it to the men or the people of the great assembly. And they, those last generation, said three things. Be deliberate in judgment, raise up many disciples or students, and make a fence for the Torah. There is so much packed into this one statement. The question begins with Moshe received the Torah at Sinai. What does that refer to? We've always traditionally understood it to mean it's the 5 books of Moses, right? It's the Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That has been what you might think when it says Moshe kibel Torah misinai. But we also know that what this Mishnah is beginning to lay out at the very beginning of Mishnaic literature altogether is it's trying to lay out the question of the word Torah. But the word Torah doesn't just mean the 5 books of the Torah. It means all the learning that ever was and that ever will be. Moses began taking that down at Sinai. And then in the fulfillment of his promise and obligation, handed that teaching to his heir, Joshua, who then handed it to the elders of the community after they settled the land. And eventually rose up the prophets who took it upon themselves. And the prophets gave it to the people, or frankly, the men of the great assembly. And so before we get to the last sort of piece of Mishnah here, the last little piece of wisdom, I just want you to think about this very broadly for a minute. Did Moses, what he received at Sinai, if we take it seriously, and what he passed to Joshua, did Joshua approach the Torah the same way that Moses did? And did the elders approach Torah the same way that Joshua did? And did the prophets approach Torah the same way that the elders did? And did the men of the great assembly approach Torah the same way that the prophets did? We want to say yes. We want to say that each and every one of them, that Torah has been unchanged from the very beginning. That exactly how the Torah behaves today is, and what it wants from us today, is exactly the same of what it wanted of Moses thousands and thousands of years ago. We want to say that. And it's part of the wonderful play of Jewish life that we can make that argument. However, we know that historically, that's not entirely true. And I think it's because of two things. Number one, historical situations change, people change, social agreements change, but there's something deep inside of us that never changes. The need to feel connected, the need to feel safe, the need to feel fed, the need to feel cared for, the need to care for others, the need to help others feel safe, the need to work on a world and hopefully make it better. Those needs never change. And so when I think about this chain of tradition, that Moses received the Torah at Sinai and gave it to Joshua. Joshua gave it to the elders, and the elders to the prophets to the men of the great assembly. It's not that their historical situations stayed the same. They were incredibly different. And it's not that their focuses stayed the same. They were incredibly different too. You look at Isaiah and Hosea and Amos, these wonderful prophets. Their concerns were different from each other, let alone different from Moses himself. But the soul of a human being doesn't change. We're all created in the image of God, and therefore we all have some very similar needs that don't change over time. The technology we use to address those needs might change, but the needs don't change. And to me, that's ultimately what Torah is trying to answer. That's what the Torah that Moses received is trying to get at, is that it's trying to meet the nape of the human soul. So when it says Moses received the Torah at Sinai and it's passed all the way down to the men of the great assembly, take the reader into consideration and think about what kind of strength and confidence does that give the reader? That gives the understanding that the process of learning, thinking, ruminating over Torah is the same process that Moses went through, and the same process that Joshua went through, and the same process that the elders and the prophets went through. It's the same process. The answers, the decisions, the technology, etc., might be different, but the process is the same. And so if I'm sitting here opening the Mishnah on a dark night in the middle of France in the 10th century, I'm going through the same process as if I'm opening this Mishnah in the 21st century in a beautiful Southern California. And it's the process that keeps us together more than just the specifics and the decisions. Which leads to the end of the Mishnah. It says, the men of the great assembly said, there are three things that one must do. One must be deliberate in judgment, have discernment and be deliberate in judgment. You have to raise up many students, and you have to build a fence for the Torah. So when it says be deliberate in judgment, to me and to my other commentators, it says that you should have the capacity to bring yourself into this process. Just because someone said it one way one time doesn't mean that you should abdicate your authority and moral authority to that. You have to respect it. You have to give it the kind of kavod and centering it and surfacing it and study it. But when you know a case and you know the case law over and over and over and over again, it doesn't mean that when two people come before you and have a conflict, that you should, because you know the case law so well, you shouldn't wait out and hear their claims. That the living part of the Torah is the part where we interact with each other. It's not just words. We're not just algorithms. We're not just machines meant to take something and spit it back out again. We're living, breathing, striving human beings. And in that, your personal discernment becomes critical. The second piece is standing up students. What is the point of learning something if you can't turn around and teach it? It becomes only for your own fulfillment and not for the fulfillment of others. Woe is to the person that learns something wonderful and keeps it to themselves. I know that when I learn something and have an epiphany, the first thing I want to do is call up my wife or talk to my other rabbinic colleagues and share this wonderful piece of Torah or wisdom. Not because I'm boastful that I figured something out, but because it's too much of a gift to keep. In the liturgy, it says, the Torah itself, Kihem chayenu v'orech yamenu uvehem nehege yomam v'layla, that the Torah is our life, it is the path of our ways. It is how we walk through the world. We must meditate on them night and day. And then it says, Lilmod ulilamed lishmor v'la'asot, that we shall learn them and teach them, to guard them and to do them, and to pass them on to the next generation. You cannot learn something and keep it to yourself. You have to learn, lilmod, and teach, lilamed. And all the better that you raise up students below you, you share these chain of Torah with the next generation. Which is the other aspect of this, is that the beginning of the Mishnah talks about where the Torah comes from. And the end of this first Mishnah tells us where the Torah should go to. Goes from Moses through all of this chain of tradition, through you, to the next generation. If anything, that is our obligation. And then the last section of the Mishnah, Va'asu siyag LaTorah. This one gets a lot of consternation from those who want to change and radically change Torah. And that's fair. Sometimes the fence becomes too high, or it's meant to keep too many people out. Or sometimes the fence, there's too many fences and you just can't get over them to get to the core of the Torah itself. It's the problem with the metaphor of the fence is, are you trying to keep something out or keep something in? And either way, that sense of protection, as strong as it is, and I think as important as it is, can also lead to a covering over of what is so beautiful. The garden is really beautiful, but does it matter how beautiful a garden is if no one can see it because there's a fence or a wall in the way? So the rabbi in this case who's reading this, or you who's reading this, you should put a fence around the Torah so you don't infringe on its primary commandments. And I wouldn't make the fence so high that you can't see the garden within. So that's the first Mishnah. It begins in the past. It's just so beautiful. It begins in the past. It affirms that you yourself are part of a chain of tradition. And then when you are passing this tradition on to other people, you have to use your discernment and your best judgment. You have to take the opportunity to invite people into the study of Torah, to be your students, just as you are mine. And when you decide to say what the Torah you think the Torah is about, just be careful. You don't have to be overly careful. I think that that's where some of us have gone wrong in history. But you do have to be careful to protect the chain as much as you're protecting the Torah itself. Any questions about the first Mishnah before we move on?
Rabbi,
Yeah, Marcy.
it's Marcy. Well, it seems to me there's a connection between the blessing that we get in the excerpt from Sanhedrin, where we are thinking of the world to come because of the time in exile, and also raising up many students. I mean, it's not only to share learning one with the other, but to perpetuate the tradition as it has been from Moshe to Yoshua down to, Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. So it's all about Ledor Vador.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And again, to me, I think it's meant to give solace and strength and confidence to a people that is in exile or is occupied, and that they don't know why studying Torah is important. And the opening blessing from Sanhedrin tells you Torah study is important because of the future. And the first Mishnah in Pirke Avot tells you Torah study is important because of the past. And that you are right. Each of us are right in the middle. We're all floating through the world, lodged somewhere between the future and the past. That's the definition of the present.
Right.
Yeah. Other questions before we move on a little bit? See if the other people joined us, which is really nice. Great. All right. So I'm going to go back and share this, and I want to just show you this wonderful midrash from Tanchuma as something that's really beautiful. Also, so Rabbi Tanchuma, which is a midrash from I think it's the 8th century, wrote some commentary, and he kind of mentions this a little bit about Mount Sinai. He says, Rabbi Tanchuma said, everyone at Mount Sinai, old and young, women and children and infants, heard the voice of God according to their own ability to understand. Moses to understand only according to his capacity, as it said from Exodus. Moses spoke and God answered him with a voice that Moses could bear. So this is really interesting for the Midrash, right? So the idea is, and I think many of you have heard this before, that when we were imagining ourselves standing at Mount Sinai, that all of us could hear revelation. And with Shavuot coming, which is this holiday that celebrates this moment, each and every one of us heard revelation in a way that we could understand it. What's new in this Midrash, though, is this last piece, that Moses understood only to his own capacity. And Moses spoke and God answered him with a voice. God answered Moses with a voice that Moses could actually understand. So there are two things I want to say about that. Number one, the working assumption is that when God answers Moses, the working assumption could have been that Moses couldn't hear the voice of God because the voice of God is too powerful. Literally could be fatal. But don't think that the voice that Moses was able to hear God's voice at all is, to me, wondrous and beautiful, because that means that if Moses could, maybe we could too. Which gets to the other point, which is that Moses himself had a certain capacity for learning. And let's just say if we play through the rabbinic literature and tell us that Moses was the absolute best student of Torah that ever was, he only had a certain level of capacity too. He only got to a certain level, which means that, as you'll see in the end of the class tonight, that there might be opportunities to listen to God's voice moving through us and through this Torah study in a way that maybe Moses never got. And the Talmud even recognizes that, and we'll read that at the very end. So this is the first Mishnah. I mean, I think it's so beautiful and so powerful. The very first of the first tells us that you're part of something so much greater and so much more ancient than maybe you realize. But that also imbues you with responsibility. And that responsibility is to continue this chain of tradition. And we as a people have done that through thick and through thick, through good times and through bad times. And I think that's really powerful. Let's look at one more little piece here. Bartanura, which is the next little text here, is a commentator from Italian commentator on the Mishnah. And if any of you know anything about kosher wines, they tend to name them after commentators who are also vintners. So Rashi, for example, is the name of a wine company, but Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo ben Yitzchak, was a winemaker in Provence, and he wrote commentaries on everything. Bartanura wrote a commentary on the Mishnah, and so his commentary is also considered authoritative on the Mishnah, but he was from Italy, and he was the other half of the winemaking world at the time. And today, if you like Bartanura, you have to realize that the name of the label is named after this commentator. So if you like the blue bottle of the really sweet, bubbly Moscato d'Asti wine, you realize that the person who created that company created it and named it after Bartanura, who is the commentator on the Mishnah. So now when you buy a bottle of Bartanura, you feel connected to Pirke Avot, which means I guess you should drink it on Shabbos. I don't know. Okay, so Bartanura has some commentaries, and throughout this class, we'll be quoting him quite a bit, because his commentaries on Pirkei Avot are considered to be even more authoritative than Rashi's. So here he says in the line, be discerning in judgment. He says, if a case comes before you 2 or 3 times, don't say this case has already come before me and I ruled a second and a third time. Rather, be discerning, which is to say, deliberate before you decide the case. This is where I got this idea from, is that what's in front of us is most important. Just because you know had spent 30 or 40 years in a career and that you know the answers to all the questions doesn't mean that those who are asking you those questions don't deserve the kavod and the sense of humanity that stands before you. So that's what Bartanora adds there. And then what he says about standing up many students, he says, this is meant to exclude the words of Rabban Gamliel. If those of you who take my Talmud class know that we've studied Rabban Gamliel. Rabban Gamliel was the head of the Sanhedrin, aristocratic family at the fall of the temple, who believed that only a certain type of class of person should come and learn in the Beit Midrash. And so this Mishnah, he says, when it says stand up many students, he's trying to exclude the words of Rabban Gamliel, who said, any student whose exterior is not like his interior shall not enter the Beit Midrash. Where do we derive that each teach Torah to every person and there's no need to inquire after them? This is the case so long as it's not be known from his way that his actions are corrupt or that he has a bad reputation. Alternatively, we may divide if he raises up a disciple in his youth. He should also do so in his old age, as is written, sow your seed in the morning, and in the evening do not hold back your hand. So here, Bartanor is adding something really beautiful. When it says stand up many students, raise up many students, there might be 2 reasons why you might not want to do that. The first is because you might only want to teach students who want to learn, or you might only want to teach the best students, or the students who can afford to pay you. Rabban Gamliel was famous for that. He only wanted the absolute best students in his school, those with the outsides who matched the insides, only those who were the most virtuous, only those who's already proven themselves. To which I would argue, and I think the Mishnah argues too, what's the point of teaching someone if they know everything already? All the more so, what's the point of teaching someone if they think they know everything already? So here, what the Bartanora is trying to add is that first barrier, we should just forget that, exclude Rabban Gamliel, and go to Rabbi Yeshua's position, which is that every person, rich or poor, capable, incapable of paying, capable or incapable of learning, needs to be taught Torah. And the obligation, as much as it is on the student to want to learn, the obligation is on the teacher to teach. And anyone who's a real teacher knows this deeply, that teachers need to teach in some ways more than students need to learn. I remember a story from Abraham Joshua Heschel when he became pretty famous in America, got a letter from a small town in Texas asking him to come and spend a Shabbat teaching in Texas. And he didn't even reply to the letter. And he was like, I don't need to go there. It's a long way. It's a small community, et cetera, et cetera. And then the rabbi of the shul with the president of the shul, and I think the shul had less than 100 families, wrote him a letter and quoted this Mishnah and this commentary. And Heschel came like 3 months later. He decided to come and he went and spent the weekend in this little town in Texas because he realized that he was being a little too haughty in his own sense of teaching. And the second barrier to teaching, which I just want to raise up before we move on, is age. I think it was Kafka who wrote Before the Law. And in the short story, it's about this man who has all these open doors and he can't decide where to go. And then the doors start to close and close and close and close and close and close and close. And it's a metaphor for age. And it's a metaphor for learning. That essentially, like the idea is that there are going to be things that are not open to you anymore. That might have been open to you before, but aren't open to you anymore. Like, for example, I don't know that I'll ever be trained to be a brain surgeon. Like, I might decide to learn the biology and the science, but I think by the time I've done all of that, moved my career over and did all that, I don't know that my hands would be able to actually, do the cutting. So there are certain things that that I won't be able to do in my life. I'll never be able to run in the Olympics and win a gold medal. I'm just too old. But Torah is different. And this is what Bartanor is getting at. Is that don't think that just because you've lived much of life without Torah, that you can't start learning Torah today. In fact, Torah is even more important because as your body gets weaker and it begins to fail and you get sick in one way or another, the more vulnerable you become. Torah never becomes vulnerable. Torah never fails. Torah never becomes weaker. In fact, the more you study it, the stronger it becomes. And so what Bartanor is trying to point out is it's not just about those who have the ability or have a bad reputation or a good reputation to study. It's also about those who are older. And it's never too late to start. There's a whole section in rabbinic literature about rabbis who didn't start to become the rabbis that they were destined to be until late in life. They had whole lives first. Reish Lakish, Rabbi Akiva, Hillel, all of them didn't learn the Aleph Bet until later in life. And they became some of our most important rabbis. And so when it says raise up many students, Bartanora is trying to add to this, raise up as many as possible over the entire course of your life. That anyone can come learn. Anyone who's made a mistake. Anyone who is a prisoner. Anyone who is an addict. Anyone who is abused. Anyone who lived a life and said, forget about Torah. The moment they come in your door, you have to bring them in, sit them down, and say, well, where do you want to begin? And so the opening of Pirke Avot is just so beautiful because it begins in the past and then imbues us with the present. I want to finish tonight with one last teaching that calls the whole thing into question in some ways. But I think it comes to answer so much about who we are. So this is a story from later in the Gemara in a section called Menachot. And it asks, what is Torah and what is its reward? I'm going to read it in Hebrew because it's really poetic, and then I'll go ahead and translate it in English and we'll study it. Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, B'sha'a sha'ala Moshe l'marom, u'matzo l'kodesh baruch hu, she'yoshev v'kosher kitarim l'otiyot. Amar lefanav, Rabbona she'olam, mi me'ekev al yadecha, amar lo adam echad, yesh she'atid l'hiyot b'sof kama dorot, va'akiva ben Yosef shemo, she'atid lidrosh al kol kotz v'kotz, talin v'tilin, shel hakalot, amar lefanav, Rabbona she'olam, haridu li, amar lo, chazar la'acharecha, halech v'yoshev b'sof shmona shorot, v'lo haya yodea, Mahen omrim, tashesh kocho kevan shehigia ledavar echad. Amar lo letalmidav, Rabbi minyan lecha. Amar lahan halacha leMoshe misinai. Nityashva da'ato. Chazar uval lefnei HaKodesh Baruch Hu. Amar lefanav, Rabbona she'olam, yesh lecha adam kezeh ve'ata noten Torah al yedei amar lo shtok. Kach aleh b'machsheva. Lifnei amar lefanav Rabbono she'olam, haritani torato harani scharo. Amar la chozor lacharecha, chazar lacharav, ra'ash shoklin basaro b'moklin. Amar lefanav Rabbono she'olam, zo Torah, zo schara. Amar la shtok, kach aleh b'machshava. Lifnei amar. Rav Yehuda says, the Rav says, when Moses ascended on high after he died, he found God, the Holy One, blessed be He, sitting and tying the crowns on the letters of the Torah. And if you look at a Sefer Torah, you'll see that there are some crowns, little flags on top, right? And Moses goes before God and says, Rabbona she'olam, Master of the universe, why are you preventing me from understanding what these little additions that you're giving them? It's almost as if Moses never got them during his lifetime, and seeing God tying these little crowns on and saying, how come you didn't teach this to me? And God said to him, there's a man who is destined to be born after many generations, and his name is Akiva ben Yosef. He's destined to derive from each and every little thorn, every crown, every mound, everything that's hanging, many, 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 many mounds of halachot, different Jewish laws. And it's for this sake that the crowns must be added to the letters of Torah, essentially for him, from Akiva, Rabbi Akiva. And so then he said before God, Master of the universe, show him to me. I must see this most powerful teacher of Torah. And God said to him, turn behind yourself. And so Moses sort of turned around and he found himself sitting in a classroom at the end of the 8th row in Rabbi Akiva's study. And he didn't understand what they were saying. So you have to understand that in the old yeshiva back thousands of years ago, students who stood in the first row, sat in the first row, were considered the most discerning students, the ones with the most prowess. And here Moshe Rabbeinu is sitting in the last row, which means he's now back to being a novice. He doesn't know anything. Moses himself, right? And so Moses heard Rabbi Akiva lecturing and didn't understand a word that he was saying. Moses' strength waned because, here he is. He experienced Sinai. He experienced the Exodus. He got Torah from Sinai, gave it to Joshua. And now Rabbi Akiva is teaching and he doesn't understand a word that Rabbi Akiva is saying. And then when Rabbi Akiva arrived at a decision of a matter, his students said to him, meaning Rabbi Akiva's students, said to him, someone in the front row, someone who's apparently knows more than Moses, who's just a yeshiva bucher, just this little schlepper student, right? He says, my teacher, Rabbi, from where do you derive this halakha? And Rabbi Akiva said, it's a halakha transmitted to Moses from Sinai. And when Moses heard this, his mind was put at ease, as too was part of the Torah that he received. So Moses is sitting there in the back of the room and he's listening to Rabbi Akiva. He doesn't understand a word that's going on. It's sort of like, imagine someone from the 17th century coming today and talking about the laws of the internet or intellectual property, or talking about the laws of international space travel, right? We have no way, they don't know anything about any of that. But when they say that, when Rabbi Akiva says, well, this is derived from a law given to Moses at Sinai, Moses finally got it. That he didn't hear everything that was necessarily given at Sinai. And that through this process of learning from one generation to the next, and one generation to the next, and one generation to the next, you arrive at Rabbi Akiva. And that the Torah has something to say in every generation. And that I only know what I know, and I can only transmit what I transmit, and then students will come after me and find new meanings in them. And how powerful is that? And so Moses' mind was settled. He felt really good about that. And so he came back to heaven and he stood before God, the Holy One, blessed be he, and said before him, Master of the universe, Rabboni Shalom, you have a man as grand as this, and yet you still chose to give the Torah through me? Why? Right? If Rabbi Akiva can expound on the Torah in ways that Moses couldn't, right? If Ben Franklin was here today in the United States and could see what we did with electricity, or what we did with sound, or what we did with transportation, he'd be dumbfounded, right? Why did you give the Torah through me? And God said to him, be silent. This is the intention that arose before me, literally arose in my mind. So Moses then said before God, Master of the universe, you show me Rabbi Akiva's Torah, now show me his reward. And God said to him, turn back around again. And Moses went back and saw that they were weighing Rabbi Akiva's flesh in a butcher shop after he was martyred, tortured to death by the Romans. Moses said before him, Master of the universe, this is Torah, and this is Torah's reward. Zo Torah, uzo schara. And God said to Moses, be silent. This intention is what arose in my mind. At the end of Menachot, we realize that what seems like a positive story, we realize that Moses didn't learn everything he needed to learn at Mount Sinai, and that he was happy about this chain of tradition. And yet at the very end of the story, we find out what happens to Rabbi Akiva, and many of us know the story. He chose to teach Torah in defiance of the Romans. This very process of learning and of ingesting and imbibing Torah and then teaching it, of raising up students, of being discerning, of putting a fence before the Torah, of fulfilling this very first Mishnah. And in the end, he's murdered and tortured. And his body parts are sold off in the shuk like a piece of meat. And so you can look at this story and its conclusion and say, what's the point? What's the point? We're beaten up, exiled, occupied, tortured people, generation after generation. What's the point? Why study Torah? And yet this text is here. And yet the Mishnah is here. And so you go back to the very beginning and you ask yourself, what's the point? And we go back to Sanhedrin, and the point is right there at the very, very beginning. Kol Yisrael yesh lehem chelek le'olam haba. Each and every one of us, no matter what we've chosen to do with our lives or who we are, has a portion in the future. And that the focus is that we all know that we're going to die one day. Every single one of us knows that our end will be the same. Everyone we ever knew, everyone we ever loved and loves us, all be gone. So the question is not what we're going to do about our death, but what do we do with our lives? How do you spend your time? And that immortal life is not something that can be achieved by just going up to heaven. Immortal life is realizing that you're part of the future and you're part of the past. The Mishnah, Pirke Avot, begins with a vision of the future that includes all of us. And then immediately in the first Mishnah begins by saying you are also part of an infinite past. And if you realize that your life begins in an infinite past and extends through your physical lifetime and into an infinite future, it almost doesn't matter how you die, because the reward for Torah is immortal life itself. Not you, not your physicality, but the knowledge you've learned and passed on. If you use discernment, if you've raised up students, and you put a fence before this process, this loving document we call the Torah, you can achieve immortality because you're part of something so much grander and greater than yourself. And that's how Pirkei Avot begins, with a promise from the future and a promise from the past. And so I'm happy to take a few last questions as it's getting dark outside. If anyone has a few questions before we call it a night. Anyone want to raise their hand and ask a question or two?
Noah, thank you for this introduction. This was a wonderful beginning.
Thanks, Allie. David, did you have a question before we end?
Just that. So the scharo thing idea seems to be the point. Is it's not the point. And,
exactly right. Like if you only look at Rabbi Akiva's demise, then you won't realize the power of his life that was, right? In the 70 years that he lived or so, what he did with that time was actually more important than his death. Moses didn't seem to get that either. And yet it's all over the Talmud. Yeah. All right, I hope you enjoy it. I hope you enjoy learning with me in the next few weeks. That was, by the way, that was just one Mishnah. Just one. There's about 50 more to go before we finish this book. So hopefully we'll learn as long as I can keep doing this, I'll keep teaching. And hopefully as long as you can keep doing this, you'll keep learning.
Day 27.
Yeah. All right, enjoy everyone. Have a good night.
Bye.